This week on Quadriga, on your marks, who wants the Olympic Games? As cities around the world prepare to apply to host the Summer Olympic Games in 2024, Germany is set to decide in March whether to bid. Berlin or Hamburg are potential candidates. Other applicants include Boston and Rome. But not everyone welcomes the Olympics. While politicians and business leaders talk of major investment in infrastructure and housing, others say the Games actually divert public money away from where it's needed. There are concerns too that huge international sporting events open the way for corruption and political propaganda, especially if the hosts are authoritarian regimes. Is the Olympic flame too hot to handle, or are the Games still a force for good? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. The countdown's on. In just a little more than 2 weeks, the German Olympics Confederation will decide whether to put Hamburg or Berlin into the running for the 2024 World Games. But opinions here are mixed. Is the skepticism warranted? Has the Olympic torch ceased to be a beacon, and what could make it burn brighter? That's what we want to talk about today on Quadriga with three people who've been following Olympic Games for quite some time now. It's a pleasure to welcome Jens Weinreich. He is one of Germany's leading sports journalists and has won multiple awards for his work as a reporter and a blogger. He has covered major sports events for more than 2 decades, including 10 Olympic Games and many soccer, gymnastic, and swimming world championships. And he's recently published an e-book on the power struggles behind the Olympic movement. And a pleasure to have Erik Kirschbaum with us. He reports for the Reuters news agency in Berlin. He was born in New York, but has been working as a journalist in Europe since 1989. He attended the World Cups in Germany and in Brazil and covered the Olympic Games in Athens and Beijing. And finally, a warm welcome to Albert Steinberger. He's a Brazilian video journalist based here in Berlin. He's covered the World Cup Championships in Brazil for German TV and has followed the events surrounding Brazil's hosting of the World Cup and the Olympic Games from the moment the country entered its first bid. He also reported from the Olympic Games 2012 in London. Jens Weinreich, one of Germany's leading polling organizations, is now measuring support in Hamburg and Berlin. And it looks like here in the capital city, the support is really hovering right around the 50% mark. Why is that? What accounts for the ambivalence?
That is typical for Berlin. And some people who remember the last Olympic bid of Berlin for the Olympic Games 2000, they also remember of all the scandals and all the negative things were connected with the bid. And it's a mix of many things. And of course, one important point is, if you look back to the Sochi Winter Olympics or to other Olympics and other mega events, all the discussion about costs, about billions of dollars, and all this is influential.
In fact, there is an initiative now here in Berlin called the No Olympia Initiative, Albert Steinberger, and it says that Berlin, which is deeply in debt, ought to be spending its money on schools, on infrastructure, on more apartments for the underprivileged. Are you surprised about this German reaction? After all, this is a very rich country in comparison to your own.
Definitely. But I think also it's more than imaginable when you look at what was the World Cup and with all the protests. I think there is a moment that everybody's questioning if it's really worthy. It's stronger than ever. If it's really worth it to host these games. And I remember in 2006 we also have like small demonstrations, but now it's the question that really divides the city. I mean, as you said, it's 50-50. So the size of it, I think it grows stronger because of exactly the protests in Brazil and all these corruption scandals.
Erik Kirschbaum, both cities, Hamburg and Berlin, are trying to drum up support for the Olympics, not least because this polling that is now going on will help determine which city, if either, actually does become the city that puts in a bid. If you were out there working with the initiatives that are trying to get support, what would you be telling them? I know that you're a fan. What would your arguments be?
Well, they need to think a little bit beyond the horizon. They need to think a little bit longer term what it could mean for for Berlin in the long term, or Hamburg. Germans sometimes get caught up in their own little world, in their own little small bürgerliche world, and they don't really think of the big picture a lot of times. I was really surprised that Munich turned down the chance to host the Winter Olympics a few years ago. It just blows me away. I mean, when you think about the World Cup 2006, what that did for Germany's reputation around the world, it was an incredible breath of fresh air, and it was a showcase for Germany, and the world got to see a modern Germany that loved sport, that had a great organization, even had great weather. They couldn't believe what great weather the Germans had that summer, and it's just something that's going to carry Germany and Germany's reputation around the world for a long, long time. And the Olympics in Berlin or Hamburg would be another chance. And the small-mindedness of a few ignorant ideas in Berlin, they think it's going to cost money. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not that money's going to be taken away from a school or a kindergarten and go to build a new Olympic stadium. It's not the case at all. There's just a lot of misinformation and ignorance out there, and I think if more Berliners would get informed, they'd probably be a lot more excited about the Olympic bid.
Jens Weinreich, Erik Kirschbaum mentions the huge euphoria that surrounded the hosting of the World Cup. What accounts for the difference? Why is it that people are so much more ambivalent about the Olympics than they were about that?
It's very difficult to compare both events. Of course, in terms of money, you can compare. In terms of the budgets, you can compare Olympics and the World Cup. But in terms of infrastructure, in terms of environment, if you talk about the Munich Olympics, the Winter Olympic bid, the bid for 2018 or 2022, they are totally different questions. And another point is it's simple to organize a World Cup in comparison to the Olympics. A World Cup, you have to organize 64 games in 4 or 5 weeks. And if you look at the big leagues, whether it be in Germany or in England or in other countries, the big leagues, they organize such games almost every 2 weeks. Such a number of games. So there's a big difference between both events.
But the thing is about Berlin has these venues already. Berlin has an Olympic stadium, a cycling rink, a swimming arena. The Olympics is a 2-week event in one city. How can that be harder than a World Cup, which is spread out across the country?
Actually, they don't have an Olympic-sized swimming arena. That's one fact. And the discussion is about other things. And I don't agree with you when you say, if you are arguing that the Olympics don't take money away from other accounts. They do, actually, because most of the costs of the Olympics are coming from public sources, and of course you could do some other things with the money, with billions of euros.
But Steinberger, Berlin's mayor claims that the Olympics would generate 40,000 jobs here in the city. Does that sound plausible to you on the basis also of your experience in your own country, Brazil?
I think they are in the moment of the bidding. When they do the bid, they promise heaven. But when it comes to reality, things look a little bit different. I mean, if you take London 2012, for example, they promised also to boom for all the industry and for all the hotels. They would really have an increase in their business. And you saw hotel business complaining and a lot of situations that it's completely different, actually. So this moment of the bid, you need to really be skeptical about what especially politicians are promising. And in Brazil, the main thing that I have to agree with you is that at the end, the public money comes to save the situation. So, for example, they just... Taxpayers' money, because, for example, you should have private investors, and then at the end you cannot find them, and then the state has to make sure that things are going to go well. So this was one of the biggest problems in the World Cup, and I think it is now in Rio as well, that the government will have to give 700 million reals, around $350 million, to exactly help on energy and safety.
Jens Weinreich, apparently Berlin's mayor did manage to drum up 100,000 signatures from people who support having the Olympics here. Just to give a brief snapshot of how divided the city is, a local politician went out last week trying to distribute donuts with Olympic logos on them and apparently was booed out of Kreuzberg, the district in the center of the city. But on the other hand, the mayor's got 100,000 signatures from people who say they are for the Olympics. So who is in favor?
The organized sport. Actually, in Berlin, you have 609,000 or so people organized in sport federations and sport clubs, and the 100,000 signatures came from organized sport. Organized sport is in favor, and actually, if you look at some events of pro-Olympics or no Olympia, so there are not so many people interested in. 100,000 sounds a little bit more than you can see in the city, and if you attend such meetings.
Erik Kirschbaum, people say support for young athletes is lagging in Germany, that there are not enough young people entering a lot of the Olympic disciplines. Would something like this give a boost to that? Or could one argue, hey, we need to take the money that we would spend on the Olympics and directly support education for young people in sports?
I think an Olympic, like a World Cup, is just a driving force for so many things. It would create jobs, would create all kinds of enthusiasm for sports, and I'm sure a lot of young people will get enthusiastic about sports again. I think the Olympics is having a problem around the world right now, keeping young people interested. The ratings are down in a lot of countries. They need to reform. They've had some problems. The Olympics were in a lot of trouble in the 70s as well, after the Montreal Olympics, which also lost a lot of money. There was a reform, and then things picked up again, and they are having problems right now, obviously, with the 2022 Winter Olympics, while the cities are bailing out on that. It's in a bit of a lull, but I really disagree with this idea it's a zero-sum game, that this euro going for a kindergarten will be taken away from the kindergarten and go to build some Olympic venue. I don't think that's the way it works. I think an Olympics adds growth, adds all kinds of things. The World Cup added about 1 percentage point to the GDP in 2006. There's a lot of intangible things that will happen when an Olympics comes to a city, and it creates a lot of jobs. There's no doubt about that.
But I think the private investors have to start to pay more bills and not only taxpayers' money. I mean, they need really to, they get a lot of increase in the profits, but they need also to share the costs. And I mean, and I think with the protests, they have been doing so, but just a tiny little start. At the end, when it comes to the real thing, the government have to save them when they do not.
I want to talk in just a minute about lessons that we can learn from games elsewhere, but perhaps one brief word on Munich, because both of you mentioned the fact that the city of Munich, in a popular referendum, actually turned down the chance to bid for the 2022 Winter Games. Jens Weinreich, why was that? What were the arguments that prevailed in Munich? Erik said he was shocked, but what accounted for the results of that?
It was a very complicated internal sporting and internal local politician fight. So there was a lot of dishonesty because in late 2013, when the decision was made in November 2013, and shortly before, a few weeks before, there were elections in Bavaria and in Germany, and there were elections in the IOC, and a German became the IOC president, Thomas Bach, and all these were very influential to the decision because sport didn't fight for the Munich Olympics. They didn't do enough, and the politicians, the local politicians, didn't do enough. The concept, in comparison to other concepts, was a brilliant concept. The concept in comparison to, if you look at the question of sustainability, it was in comparison, a brilliant concept comparison to Sochi, comparison to other bids. And they had a big chance. It was, I say that, it was a historical chance for Germany, for Munich, but they didn't use it because of internal fights.
It could have been the first Olympics, in a Winter Olympics that had been in a summer venue. It could have been history making right there. It would have been a fantastic linking of the 36 Winter Games in Garmisch with Munich. It would have brought so many advantages. And the reason I was shocked is just it was just a great chance for Germany. And if you live in Germany now, you see Germans are against the airport, they're against the train station in Stuttgart, they're against the Philharmonic in Hamburg. At the moment, it's really hard for Germans to accept any kind of a big project. They just don't want to do it. They don't want it in my backyard. They don't want it.
So will there be a referendum in this case, and could the same thing happen here or in Hamburg?
It will be, definitely, because that is one lesson out of the Munich, even out of the Munich 2018 bid. There took place a referendum, but just in one city, and for 2020, for 22, it took place in 4 regions. So, and there will be a referendum shortly before Hamburg or Berlin will give their official application to the IOC in
look
September.
If you look around in Berlin and Hamburg, you see advertising for the Olympics. It's new for me. I mean, an Olympic bid before was a no-brainer. You didn't have to advertise it. But in Germany, they're actually advertising. They're trying to drum up public support for it. So I think they're learning from the lessons from the Munich debacle.
So let's see what lessons we can learn from other international games. Let's take a look at some of the games of recent years and the conflicts that surrounded them.
Preparations for the 2016 Summer Olympics in Brazil are in full swing. Venues are being tested. The security plan is in place. Brazil has learnt a lot from its experience hosting the Soccer World Cup in 2014. But problems remain. For instance, Rio is struggling to deal with sewage in the bay where the sailing events will be held. Few recent Olympic Games have entirely escaped controversy. The 2012 London Games were seen as a financial success, but some questioned why a festival of sports and fitness was sponsored by companies such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola. The Beijing Games in 2008 saw allegations of human rights violations and a crackdown on promised media freedoms. The 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia, prompted claims President Putin was seeking to make political use of sport. And huge cost overruns meant they were not just the most expensive Winter Games ever, but probably the most controversial as well.
Albert, there were big protests in your country last year around the World Cup, and there's been a lot of negative reporting about readiness for the Olympic Games. But the IOC overseers have just been to Brazil and say things are now looking good, they are on track. Do you think that's right, or is it a bit of whitewashing?
Yeah, I think for the Olympic venues, everything is all right. They look at the stadiums and the other stuff, they are in place. But when you see, for example, at the problem of the Guanabara Bay, they were planning to cut the pollution in 80%, and they already noticed that it won't be possible. And that's why the Sailors Association had already went and said that it's actually dangerous to get a disease if you sail in such conditions. And you also have dozens of other cases. For example, on the golf course, you have now the Occupy golf course going on in Brazil at the moment, because they are against the golf course is made in a reserve and where you have endangered species. So you have a lot of problems, and the venues get ready, but what remains for the city, so the infrastructure, they may not get ready on time. That's what happened in the World Cup, that you had like all the stadiums ready, but actually the infrastructure that was linking one city with another in the World Cup in Brazil was really complicated because we don't have a very good infrastructure among the cities, so we have to do everything by plane. It was not ready. They planned a speed train between São Paulo and Rio. It was not ready. It won't be even ready for the Olympics, maybe. So this is something that is problematic, but I think the Olympic Games in such sense brought political will for Rio. Rio always, I heard since I'm a boy in Rio that about the metro line, tube stations that would cross the whole city. At the end, it was never ready, and it's going to be ready now for the Olympics. So it's weird because sometimes it gives also pressure that things have to be done. And in Rio, I think it will have a positive impact, although there are lots of controversial things, evictions, pollution, also construction sites that they're not legal, so they can, I don't know, they have ambiental costs as well, so in this construction site. So there is a huge problem going on because things have to be done quickly.
Erik Kirschbaum, same story in Sochi as well, with venues and infrastructure that weren't ready on time, huge promises made, cost overruns, corruption, and so on. Can it be done a different way, or is this just inherent in the whole process? I see Jens nodding, but you tell us first. And
well,
then...
I think they're learning their lessons. The IOC is not stupid, and they're scared that all the cities for 2022, except for 2, jumped off. And they're trying to reform these things. They're trying to change these things. But as Albert mentioned, the Olympics are a driving force for a lot of positive things. The pollution in the bay, that's an issue being tackled now. The public transportation in Brazil was a problem, but the World Cup worked out fine. I mean, the world got to see, hey, it works in Brazil anyhow. They managed to do it. The world got to see Germany as an incredibly efficient place with fantastic transportation infrastructure, everything else, and got to see the Germans are friendly, funny people. The world got to see a new Germany. And I think the Olympics is an incredible driving force for positive things. And I think that's often overlooked in this dollar and cents calculation of whether an Olympics is worth it or not.
So we have the two sides there, Jens Weinreich. On the one hand, the idea that a lot of promises are made by the politicians that in the end aren't really fully kept. And on the other hand, perhaps a realist saying, but even less would have gotten done if we didn't have the games. Where do you come down?
You will be surprised, I think. To your question before, I think, yes, it can be done in a different way. And that's my big problem with the German bid, for instance, because it's not transparent enough. You can create a totally new kind of Olympic bid and a totally new kind of Olympic organization. But I don't see it in Hamburg or Berlin.
What would be
right
the elements
now.
Of that?
You have to
past.
start with referendums. You have to make sure, you have to be transparent. You have to talk about you have to not only to talk about the good things, so-called good things, not only propaganda, both sides, and you have to develop an idea behind how can you cope with the IOC Agenda 2020. Yeah, there are some points in Berlin and Hamburg bid, but for me it's not enough. Probably it would be enough to put it together, two bids, Hamburg and Berlin. That would be an idea, because it's possible now. The IOC has opened some windows and is in a discussion round right now. And that's, for instance, that's totally new, because for the last 2 decades, there were 2 official rounds of Olympic bidding. The first is application phase. And after the application phase, they decide whether or not to get in the final round. Final round is candidate phase. Now they start with the so-called invitation phase, a discussion phase. Actually, the first round, the first talks take place next week in Lausanne.
The trouble with referendums in Berlin is that not enough people take part in them. The last 2 referendums Berlin had for the Tempelhof Airport and the energy system didn't even get 25% of the vote. There wasn't even a quorum for it. The idea is a great idea. Let's have a referendum on everything. But the trouble is the people just won't take part, or they're not informed enough to know what's going on. If there had been a referendum in Germany about the euro, there would be no euro in Germany or Europe right now. Referendums are a great idea, but in practice, I'm not sure that they would work.
In terms of cost control, Jens Weinreich, I saw on your blog an absolutely astonishing number just in terms of the cost of submitting a bid. Can you remind us what that number was? I've been looking for it here in my notes, but...
In Berlin and Hamburg, they plan with 50 million US, or 50 million euros, actually. I saw Boston in the US for 24, I think the plan is 75 million US dollars, I think. And it's been said that Sochi, for instance, or Qatar for the World Cup, they have paid probably 200 million or more. It's unbelievable.
Albert Steinberger, in terms of these points about transparency and getting people on board, I mentioned the big protests we saw in your country last year around the World Cup. Has Brazil devised good ways of working with the public, or has it basically just gone over people's heads?
I think Brazil is the worst example on such matter, because actually Brazil, we have, after like our democratic period from 1989, we started to have more public control among corruption. That's why we have so many corruption cases, because before they were not controlled. And those organs, they are not working properly during the 2 main events, World Cup and Olympic Games, because actually it has to be done quickly, and if you have to go through all the licenses and everything else, you won't have the time to do it. So they're simply like skipping such processes and saying, well, let's do it anyway. And that's exactly the kind of lack of transparency that's going on. And you have to have sustainable. London, I think, is quite a good first step for such thing, that they planned like after the Olympics. Olympics cannot be an end in itself. It has to be a process that leads to somewhere else. I mean, Barcelona 1902, it's one of the typical cases of success that they always say, because they were aiming and being one of the cultural capitals in Europe, and they used the games for that. And I think you have to, in Rio, it's just an end in itself. We have to make it, and this is not the way it should be done.
I got to smile even because I think Brazil is even more transparent in one way than Germany ever was. And you can follow, you can download the newest information about the budget, the newest information about the construction contracts and so on. And that is something totally new. Yes, they did it in Vancouver during the 2010 Olympics. They did it in London as well. That was perfect. That was really transparent at the end of the phase. And now they do it in Brazil. That for a German, it's totally new because our transparency laws are so-called 19th century.
But the thing is, like, it happens in the environment of the country. I mean, in Brazil, all the costs are there to have a control, because corruption is so spread that we need to have also costs. So, and that's one of the things that I think in Brazil works quite fine at the moment. That's why we have like so many court cases of corruption. But we also have the way of thinking and of developing things in Brazil is corrupt in its core. So it needs to be changed. And that's in the sense, I think it's not, and I think Germans wouldn't need such a close control in such matter.
Yes.
But the mood in Brazil, though, before the tournament last year was, oh no, it's not going to happen, protests. Once they started the tournament, the whole country just lit up for it. It was such a fantastic atmosphere. And when Germany knocked Brazil out, I was waiting there at the ferry, and the Brazilians were cheering the Germans for playing such a great soccer match. Sure. It was the most incredible thing I think I ever saw.
It's always like this, isn't it? I mean, in London as well, it was like this.
Yeah.
They were quite doubtful, and then started in London 2012, and also in Germany in 2006. They were like, I remember deputies saying, "Well, I fear for foreigners that go around Berlin because of Nazi situations or neo-Nazi scene." And actually, what you saw, it was completely different. So you always have this feeling before a party that people won't come or it will rain. So I think this is normal, and when it starts, it lights up.
Jens Weinreich, our report mentioned the immense commercialization that has come to surround the Games. And although London in many ways is regarded as a positive example in general, certainly the commercialization in London was very extreme. Can anything be done about that? Is there a different way there?
I wouldn't agree with the observation. I think even at the Olympics, yes, you have strong, let's say, IOC laws. They have to protect their top sponsors, and they have a strong law for other sponsorship revenues. But I mean, in comparison to other events, let's see Formula One. I mean, that is not so strict.
The Atlanta Games in '96 were a bit hijacked by Coca-Cola, were a bit too much commercialism. And then there was a reaction in Sydney 4 years later. It was one of the best games ever because they were able to take a lot of the commercialism out. So just because there's one year, one Olympics where it's a bit too much, they always seem to correct themselves, the Olympics. So.
How's that looking in Brazil? Is it something that people find disturbing, or do they take it in stride?
I think it's normal. The main things that it was quite complicated during the World Cup, for example, is that you bring rules of your sponsors inside the stadiums. And one of the biggest problems was, for example, beer was not allowed inside a Brazilian stadium for 5 or 10 years because it leads to hooliganism in Brazil. And then because of the sponsor, they had to sell beer. You haven't had big hooliganism cases in Brazil, but I mean, this is a little bit, you don't respect the laws of your country, and that's a bad example, I would say. But I think this sponsoring, it's a good way to try to share the costs.
Jens Weinreich, cost control, something that people in Berlin and Hamburg are actually talking about a lot. Berlin says that it's considering in its bid proposing that the IOC members and overseers should couch surf while they're here. So sleep in Airbnb apartments or, you know, on my couch. Is this a realistic aspect and something that really could help get costs under control, or is it sort of window dressing?
It's a sort of window dressing, but I'm not criticizing it. I mean, I like the idea in general, and I know some IOC members who would definitely do that, no question at all. But if you look at the real costs, it doesn't matter.
Are there other innovative ideas out there, Erik Kirschbaum, for how to do the Olympics in a different, more sustainable, more cost-conscious manner?
Well, Jens mentioned earlier, and I think the idea is fantastic, of Hamburg and Berlin doing a joint bid. And as he mentioned, the IOC...
Realizing for our viewers, just briefly, they're only an hour and a half apart by high-speed train.
Right, 300 kilometers, so it's definitely doable. And the IOC is opening the door now for Olympics taking place in 2 cities or 2 countries. They want to reform. They're open to this idea. So yeah, I think there's a lot of fantastic ideas. And if Hamburg and Berlin do it together, you can say you saw it on Deutsche Welle first.
It's too late now. I mean, of course you have to teach the IOC a little bit. You have to take their arguments and then you say, okay, listen, we hear you and we propose something new. But they do it in the old way, more or less.
People often tend to lump FIFA and the IOC together and say these are just organizations devoted to patronage, to pseudo-corruption, if not outright corruption. Do you think that's right, or would you say the IOC truly is on a different track now?
One cannot say the IOC and FIFA. For instance, one big power broker in the IOC, within the IOC, it's actually Sheikh Ahmed from Kuwait. And he also plays a role in FIFA, you know. I mean, you have to look at people. Huh? Yes, I know a lot of IOC members. They are 102 now. I would say yes, honest people, transparent policy of those people. FIFA is more difficult. FIFA is more difficult. The leadership of FIFA, 25 members in the executive committee. Still some corrupt people in it. FIFA has much bigger problems right now.
Albert Steinberger, you've been in Germany for a couple of years now. Would you say that the political culture in Germany is such that they would be able to get at some of the corruption issues that you have talked about in Brazil in a different way? Is there greater transparency here, would you say, or...?
I believe so. I think it will be possible to do things more efficiently. And I mean, 2006 was a great example of how they built venues, and they even, I mean, we did some stories even on like lessons that Germany could teach Brazil, like in such matter of like the Bahnhof, the train station here in Berlin, for example, that was supposed to be ready only 2007, and they made it faster so it could host the World Cup here, or such things that in Brazil will be unthinkable, unimaginable.
Erik Kirschbaum, whichever German city does put in a bid, if in fact either one does, it's going to be up against some fairly tough competition, apparently including my own hometown, Boston. What would be the characteristics here that might lead the committee to decide in favor of a German city? If you were supporting one of those German bids, what would you be telling them?
Well, I think in the current mood, having a lot of venues already in place would be helpful, where not a lot of building and a lot of cost has to go into it. The $51 billion for Sochi is a headline that just is a nightmare for everybody. That's like 10 times more than the Olympics cost before that, Winter Olympics. So I think a city like Berlin, with its stadiums and its infrastructure and its hotels in place, would have an advantage, and a city like Hamburg as well. Boston will have to dig deep in its pocket to build a lot of these venues. So yeah, I think geography plays a big role as well. The IOC tends to want to spread it around. It hasn't been in Europe for a long time, which will be the case. It would be an advantage. The United States hasn't hosted a Summer Olympics for a while either, so that's an argument for Boston's favor?
Germany, of course, hosted some very headline-making Olympics in the past, 1972, Munich, and 1936, right here in Berlin. Now, on the one hand, Jens Weinreich, we have an Olympic stadium in Berlin. It's called the Olympic Stadium. That possibly could be seen as a plus. But are the 1936 Olympics, sponsored, of course, by the Nazis, is there also a shadow that would taint a German bid even now?
It's hard to say. Of course, some people will try to, not openly, but they will try in secret in secret talks. They will try to go against the Berlin bid because of 36. But I think, I mean, even at the World Cup in 2006, the final took place in the Nazi Olympic Stadium. I mean, who was talking about it?
And in fact, Germany did renovate the stadium already in conjunction with
personally,
that tournament,
I don't like the stadium. Personally, I would. Yes, I always think about the 36 if I see the stadium. But I mean, on the other hand, it would be nonsense. It would be absolutely nonsense to build a new stadium. No question at all.
One of the things I like about living in Germany is, over the years, is seeing Germany gradually exorcise a lot of its ghosts of its Nazi past. And the whole generation now was born after World War II. As we know, about 10 years ago, they put the Reichstag wrapped by Christo. And after that, the Reichstag, which was also a symbol of the Nazis, became just a whole new building. And I would think that the Olympics in Berlin could be a way of just exercising a lot of this past from the Nazi past from Germany as well. I hope Berlin gets the Olympics in my lifetime. I'd like to see that.
Albert Steinberger, back in the early decades of the Games, there actually were Olympic disciplines and prizes, apparently, for art and architecture, interestingly enough. Two of Berlin's city councilmen have just pointed that out and said, maybe this is something that could become a unique selling point here in Berlin, where we have so many young artists, such a very lively scene of young people, entrepreneurs, creative minds. Is that something that you could imagine possibly expanding the Games or going back to those early roots?
That would be interesting. I think one of the points is that the Olympic Games have to change themselves in the sense of get more people together, in the sense of that people feel part of the game. And the World Cup, for example, in 2006 in the Fun Fest was they tried a little bit to, okay, if you don't have a ticket, you can also take part of the party and go to the Fun Fest. And you also have that in the Olympic Games. But this is just little. If you play with really like the whole I don't know, the face of the city and what the city has to offer, it will be an interesting matter, definitely. I mean, and I think you need to think of such things.
Jens Weinreich, when you, in your experience, you've been to more games, covered more games than any of us. When you look at all of that experience and then here at your hometown, would you want to see the games take place here or not?
They got to organize it in another way. I don't see the idea now. And as long as I don't see it, for instance, I think the idea of Boston, some of the what they offer, the idea to combine the many universities in Boston and use their venues and so on, that's more sexy for me. Sounds much more sexy than the Berlin bid.
So if you were redesigning the Berlin bid, what element would you change or add to it to give it that kind of a unique approach?
There are some nice ideas, but I would open it up. I would say, okay, let's start with transparency first. Transparency first, let's discuss, and then we decide.
Erik Kirschbaum, it's pretty clear where you stand. You want to see the games come. You'd like possibly to see them spread out in between Hamburg and Berlin. Other aspects that you can imagine that would make 2024 games in these German cities really different from some of the negative examples that we've seen?
I think Albert talked about as well, the arts, getting the artists in Berlin involved and Germany involved, and the whole fan festivals of the World Cup, just that whole kind of spirit where even people without a ticket can take part and be involved. In Germany, they have this fascination with the public viewing, which means something else in English, but these public festivals where people can watch the events taking place inside the stadium on a big giant screen outside this. I think Germany has shown the world that a whole country, a whole city can get behind something like that without having to pay a lot of money for a ticket to actually be inside. And that's something I think Germany is really, really good at and can show the world you don't have to pay a lot of money to still be part of a big sporting event like that, the way Germany's done it in the past.
In terms of arts, architecture, and history, for instance, I think the most interesting Olympic bit can come from Paris. They haven't decided now, but I mean, if they use their city, it can be much more interesting and it can be magnificent, much more interesting than London, for instance.
Well, why do Germans don't want the Olympics here? I'm just so blown away by that idea. You're so good at organizing things. You can show the world what you can do. Why don't you want the games here?
Remember, I told you, I mean, I was more or less in favor of the bid of Munich. Not in general in favor of the Olympics, but in this special case, I looked at the bid and on the idea, and I saw, yes, you can do it. And there is a kind of cost control. There is a kind of legacy, absolutely, with big history. And I was in favor of this, more or less. And I don't see it in the bidding process in Berlin, and I don't see it in Hamburg.
Let me get Albert Steinberger to weigh in here before our program comes to an end. If you were out there telling the IOC which way to go, would you be in favor of seeing the games happen here, or?
I believe so. I believe so. I'd like to see also the games in Berlin and take place, and I think Germans could give an example of trying to make it more sustainable and bring this sustainability out of the games, like creative ideas.
And what would those be? What would your favorite selling point be for say Hamburg, Berlin?
I would say,
offer?
Well, Berlin, I think you can really try to focus with the artists and with the vocation of the city, and works more out of that. I mean, and then try to get this, make it more involve people more, and that's something that Berlin has as its core.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. We'll see what happens with these bids. In 2 weeks, we'll know more. Thanks very much for being with us today. And thanks to all of you out there for joining us. See you soon.